Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's second in our series of seminars looking at the future of international students in Australia. Today's session, we're going to look at some of the experiences coming out of Canada in terms of them managing their international student numbers and what learnings we can take away here in Australia. I'm Tim Kane. I'm a senior economist at CEDA based in Canberra, and I have the privilege of facilitating today's discussion. Before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which we are all collectively meeting today. For me in Canberra, that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and obviously extend that same respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people on the call with us today. A really big thank you to NAB for sponsoring the series. It's sponsorship like this that really does help us to put these together, and we wouldn't be able to do these sorts of events without our sponsors and members. So very much appreciate their sponsoring this. Um, Briefly, before we kick off, I would like to just touch on CEDA's Progress 2050 vision. As many people would know, CEDA is thinking about the way that we position ourselves in terms of our research, our public discourse, our events, looking at a generation of change and what we really would like to see coming down the track. There's two sort of elements to that. That's building a strong economy and a strong social compact. And for everybody, if you're interested, there's a dashboard and goal tracker and a number of other things that you can log on to the CEDA website to get a bit of a sense of. Today's session covers two of the goals, which is one being Australia's skills, knowledge, and ideas are sought after locally and globally, and obviously invested in, and another goal as to our success being characterized by the vibrancy of our workplaces and diversity of our society. So it's really important that we, keep these sorts of things in mind in terms of when we're having these debates. It's good to link it back to what we're trying to achieve longer term. On today, as many people are aware, there's been debate in the post-COVID world in Australia around managing migration and particularly relevant to an influx of international students. Both sides of government have their own ideas and ways of managing those numbers. And last year, a cap was proposed, but that didn't make it through the Senate. So instead, Australia's been using instruments such as Ministerial Direction 111 to prioritise and sort of rationalise numbers across institutions. Canada has recently also gone through a very similar experience. However, in Canada's case, they did impose caps and has subsequently seen a very substantial drop in the number of new commencing students. So I think that's a really good segue to introduce our speakers today. So I have Gabriel Miller, who is the President and CEO of Universities Canada. I have Helen Kronberger, who is the Director of International Education at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, or Austrade. And I have Sasko Markovski, who is a partner at Fragomen. So before I hand over to our illustrious speakers to give some opening remarks, I would just like to let everybody know that we are using an app called Pigeonhole for questions. So please feel free. The link and the passcode should be appearing in your live stream window. And the password, just to reiterate today, is student 2025, all one string, all caps. And so the other thing is that when you're in that app, you can post your questions, but you could also vote on other questions that are there. So if there are similar sorts of questions, I would encourage you to vote on those. We'll try and get through as many as we possibly can, but recognizing that we will try and prioritize those that have a sort of broader, I guess, support to be asking. So without further ado, I will hand over to Gabe to make his opening remarks. Thank you so much, Gabe.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I just want to start by thanking you and CEDA for organizing this event. I've found huge value in having conversations with our international counterparts, not just on this issue, but frankly on the challenges that we're facing in higher education in Canada generally. It's remarkable and sometimes depressing to find out how similar the challenges are in a number of countries that we work closely with. And it's particularly exciting for me to be part of this because Australia is a relatively new personal discovery for me. I've made my first couple of trips there in the last couple of years, and the number of similarities between Australia and Canada are really striking. The only differences that come to mind are the weather and the coffee, and Australia beats us on both of those. So I want to tip my cap to you on that, especially the coffee. I wasn't prepared for how good the coffee would be in Australia. I just want to take a couple of minutes to say a little bit about us at Universities Canada and also about broad view of this issue before turning it back to Tim. My introduction really to the international student issue was when I began the job as CEO of Universities Canada, which was 18 months ago. And Universities Canada represents 97 universities across the country, which is pretty much all of the public nonprofit universities in Canada, from small, liberal arts style universities right up to our biggest research intensive schools. And when I joined the organization, we were well into a crisis in Canada on international education. And the government had taken sweeping and severe steps to reduce the number of new international students who would be admitted. Their announcements were not over when I began in March 2024. There'd be a continuous dribble of changes and messaging from the government for several months to follow. But the first concern was about the financial impact on our member institutions. And of course, that goes on now. And a big part of the challenge in Canada is figuring out how we will fund higher education when such an important source of revenue has dried up in such a short amount of time. But increasingly, the more time I've spent on this file, I've actually found myself much more engaged in, I think, the question about what's the impact on the country's economic future. As I've learned more about international education, three things have really jumped out to me in Canada. One is that it was an extraordinary challenge and achievement for the country to go from being almost a zero presence, really, as a destination for international students to being a major player globally in 10 or 15 years. The second is that international students seem to be part of the answer to the age-old Canadian immigration dilemma, which was we were excellent at attracting talented people here, but very poor at allowing them to use their talents because of credentialing problems. And suddenly we had a way to bring talent here and then have them get their credentials in Canada. It seemed like an ideal solution. And then thirdly, and this struck me most in a trip to Singapore last year when I met with a group of Asian business leaders, I was told that they felt one of Canada's greatest strengths in the region was our network of alumni. And it struck me that there are hundreds of thousands of people now in different parts of the world who have ties to Canada that they wouldn't have otherwise had because of their education experiences. And that is extremely relevant to the country now because, as you may have heard, our most important trading relationship has grown somewhat complicated in the past year, and we're looking to diversify and strengthen ties to other parts of the world. And we need people who understand those parts of the world and who like Canada. So for all of these reasons, despite the fact that the country has been going through extreme growing pains on this issue, the overall effect on me has been to deepen my belief in the importance of international education and the importance of this conversation as part of us restoring that here in Canada.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Gabe. It's so interesting to hear your perspective from Canada, and I'll now add the Australian perspective, but of course this comes from an Austrade perspective specifically, and I know there will be those on the call quite familiar with that, but for anyone not familiar with Austrade's role, we promote Australian education and training globally. We offer client services that help education and training providers to grow and diversify internationally, and our job is to source and provide data and insights through our education data and insights platform service. So it's been a really interesting time for the sector here, of course, and for global student mobility in general. And with a really changed policy context in Australia and, of course, across all of the traditional study destinations, one of the main questions that we've been asked lately is whether Austrade's promotional work is in fact still aligned to Australian government policy. And of course, it absolutely is. International education as a sector remains very important to Australia. It is our largest services export. It remains central to our visitor economy and society, but also to our international relationships and our people-to-people links. So it's a really important mechanism by which we work with international partners, and that includes in creating shared solutions to shared challenges like climate change and to work towards a green economic transition, and that can be through skills collaboration and research collaboration as well. It's also still really central to Australian government priorities and strategies. So you can see examples of that with the Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040 and the roadmap for Australia's economic engagement with India. The sector still plays a really important role in building influence and growing two-way trade and investment internationally. And as you've just referenced, Gabe, for us, we're drawing on a global Study Australia alumni community that has reached more than 3 million international graduates. So on top of all of that good stuff and the connections, it's also a pillar of many of Australia's free trade agreements and regional trade agreements. And that gives us access and gives our providers access to government collaboration on education and skills uplift, to in-country provider partnerships, and to transnational education delivery. I think it's really clear now that global disruption to international trade is also changing international student mobility patterns. And we saw some of this starting to emerge during the pandemic, but it's really being consolidated now in changing student flows. We're seeing changes in preferences and demand amongst prospective students, and we're also seeing behavioural shifts amongst those most economically impacted sending student families. And this is playing out across the traditional destinations. So, I mean, we're seeing that demand for the big four, as we're often referred, English-speaking destinations really shifting to a more dispersed type of demand amongst a larger group of destinations. So I've seen these referred to recently as the Big 10 by ISEF and others. And these destinations include Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, the UAE, China, the Netherlands, Italy, and more. And these rapidly growing destinations, especially those in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, are really offering a growing number of closer to home but high quality and English talk programs. So with that significance to Australia and with that growing competition internationally, it's always necessary to be promoting the quality and integrity and the breadth and the depth of Australia's offering. And this does mean raising awareness of the breadth and depth of capability, but it also means positioning Australia as the global partner of choice and provider of choice and growing preference for Australia, as we do every day among prospective learners, parents, agents, sponsors, industry players, employers, and governments worldwide. So I would finish my opening remarks just by saying that international students remain welcome to study in Australia, and international education remains a real priority for Australia, and Austrade will continue to fulfil its responsibilities on global marketing and promotion.
Thanks, Helen. I'm pleased to be here today. Just a bit of background about Fragomen. Fragomen is a global immigration law firm. So my perspective comes from being an immigration lawyer practicing in this area for about 25 years. We have many clients who kind of employ student visa holders in their work across Australia, across many sectors. So we often see and dealing with visa holders with respect to kind of work visa applications and supporting them in other other kind of areas as necessary. So my perspective comes from what we're seeing necessarily on the ground with a visa holder. So as Helen said, international education is a really important sector in Australia, with what's been happening not only in Canada but also other key markets such as UK and the US. I think Australia has the opportunity to present itself as a preferred option to many international students. We do need to ensure we're attracting that quality, which Helen mentioned, and that our student programs do continue to form an integral part of our overall migration strategy. We don't want to effectively kind of close the door to genuine students through subtle reactive changes, and that kind of gradual recalibration of settings does work better and provides greater amount of certainty not only to prospective students but also those already in Australia. As we know, the government, as part of its migration strategy reforms, which had started nearly 2 years ago, there has been a deliberate tightening of student policy settings over the past 18 months, with a number of changes introduced, particularly last year, impacting on application as well as grant numbers. These included the genuine student requirement, lifting of English language, financial capacity settings, also essentially doubling the visa application charges as well from middle of last year. As Tim mentioned, in the absence of legislative caps, national planning levels were introduced as well to control the flow of applications, supplemented by ministerial directives on the processing of offshore and the prioritisation of offshore applications. The impact that this has had on program numbers, most recent kind of reports from the Department of Home Affairs show a number of key shifts. Firstly, when we're looking at the last few program years up to June this year, lodgements have decreased substantially in student visas, so there's been a 25% overall decrease in numbers. Grant rates have remained steady over that same period, with the rate of offshore grants actually increasing, whilst in Australia we're seeing literally a 10% increase in refusal rates as well. The offshore increase is probably obviously no doubt in conjunction with the reduction in actual numbers, but also does indicate better screening and perhaps better recruitment from with education providers in terms of the quality of the candidates that are applying for their application, their student visas. But in addition to it's also the impact of the doubling of application fees as such, which is particularly impacting sectors such as the ELICOS or English sector. The onshore changes do reflect that introduction of that genuine student requirement. So there's a higher degree of scrutiny of applications, particularly for those individuals looking to study further in Australia or prolong their stay by applying for new visas and studying longer than originally intended. What this higher degree of refusal rate has seen in Australia is that we've seen a substantial increase in the amount of applications that are going to the Administrative Review Tribunal for these refusals. And currently there's somewhere in the order of about 33 to 35,000 applications which relate to the refusal of student visa applications. So that's creating a big issue at the ART, which it's going to take quite some time to actually process those matters. We're also seeing kind of an increase in overall numbers of student visa holders in Australia, particularly as a result of that initial kind of post-COVID surge. There's backlogs in application processing as well, resulting in increased numbers of bridging visa holders in Australia as well, which is creating further issues for the Department of Home Affairs. Temporary graduate student visa numbers are also increasing. There are currently well over 200,000 people holding these type of visas. More students are choosing to remain in Australia post-graduation to work, and this is despite some of the tightening of the criteria of this visa category last year. This kind of visa, this temporary graduate visa, enables graduates to work in Australia for periods varying from 18 months to up to 5 years, depending upon their nationality as well as the pathway they're applying for. So considering that the impact that student numbers have on our net overseas migration numbers, they usually account for somewhere in order between 40 to 50% of overall numbers. It's going to be interesting to see how this steady increase in student numbers, what that increase will have, and those remaining post-study will impact overall government projections as well as targets. What that might also mean for the future recalibration of the student visa program, as well as the overall immigration narrative. Might leave it at that. Thanks, Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Sasko, and also thank you, Gabe and Helen. Apologies to anybody who knows I had a minor hiccup with my IT arrangements there, but I think we're back and running. So that is great. I might just kick off and sort of ask the $1 million question, Gabe. Really interested in the context of this debate that's kind of raging here, and the fact that Canada has gone through that very similar sort of process. You imposed the caps on international student numbers early last year, I think it was. What are some of those key lessons that you think that we can take away in Australia from the experience that you've had so far?
Sure. Well, I think let me say three things. First, let me talk a little bit about what the cap has consisted of, what its effective has been, and then what I think the lessons are. Something that's dawned on me recently as I've been doing some interviews about this is we use the term cap in two ways. There's obviously the cap, which is literally putting a limit on the number of students who can come in. But in Canada, it's really become shorthand for a series of measures the government took that included capping the number. And you can really only understand what's happened in Canada, I think, if you look at the cumulative effect of what the government did. So first on the cap itself, it actually happened in two pieces. In January of 2024, the government announced it was going to reduce the number of new students admitted to Canada study by 35%. And then 8 months later, it further announced another 10% increase. So then it went from 35 to 45% decrease. But it also made a number of other changes, including changes to the rules governing which students could stay in the country and work after graduation, an increase in the financial requirements of students coming to study in Canada. And crucially, in Canada, it added a requirement for students to get an approval letter from the province in which they were going to study before the federal government would approve their study permits, which takes a system in Canada which is already famously slow and bureaucratic and makes it much slower and more bureaucratic. So when we talk about the cap, I think generally what we're really talking about is, yes, that decision to put a hard limit, but also this prolonged period of multiple measures announced by the government in Canada. And the impact has been far greater than even I think the government imagined. First of all, the goal was really to be reducing and eliminating the number of students who were coming here kind of under false pretenses, usually through career colleges that were, in many cases, recruiting students who'd been led to believe that this was a sure route to permanent residency, and in many cases were really being used as temporary workers. And those were clear abuses of the system, and they were addressed. What wasn't part of the plan was to see a huge number of the people who were coming in and studying legitimately in universities leave, but that's exactly what we've seen. And it's at least half of the new students coming into the country to attend university has disappeared. And that's not just at the undergraduate level, but we're seeing a substantial drop in graduate students as well. Drop in application numbers, a tremendous drop in approval rate, and obviously then resulting drops in enrollment. And what's been left is the rump of an international recruitment system, and a system whose flaws now I think have been much more exposed because suddenly the country is having to work much harder to bring in the students it needs. And the worst symptoms of that are a brand that has taken a huge hit internationally, particularly in places like India, and a visa processing system that's just not competitive with other parts of the world, and which is making it even harder for us to keep students who are interested in Canada from walking away and going to places like Australia or the UK. So in terms of lessons, I mean, I think the really big lesson is don't make public policy in a panic. And that's exactly what happened in Canada. Our government found itself both politically, because the government at the time was in deep political trouble and almost certainly likely to lose the next election, but also a growing sense of unease in the population about housing prices, and that suddenly being correlated with immigration numbers. And it's not to suggest there isn't any relationship between those two, but it crystallized into a political crisis for the government, and it moved very, very quickly to take very sweeping action. And I think we all know that just as when we make panic decisions in other parts of our lives, the effects are generally to make simplistic decisions, to make blunt decisions, to underestimate the unintended consequences, and not to be nuanced enough in terms of the variety of objectives we're trying to achieve. And so it leaves a new government under Prime Minister Carney with a dual objective, which is to return immigration rates to a sustainable level, but also to attract the talent that our economy needs. And right now, Canada really only has an answer to the first of those. We have a way of bringing numbers down, but we've thrown away what was one of our most powerful tools for bringing the talent into the country and developing it that our economy is going to need. And so that is the job now that is left to be addressed in the wake of a decision to adopt caps.
Thanks. I understand that Tim's still having some technical issues, so I might just kind of talk a little bit and just mention what Gabe kind of thing. I guess in terms of it, from Australia's perspective, I kind of looking at it, I think it's about trying to attract the best kind of global talent that's around. Like there is this ongoing debate about managing numbers and how that kind of impacts the the overall trust and integrity of the program. There's we as I said earlier, we really need to kind of in Australia continue to focus the best talent. We need students who are going to thrive academically and essentially contribute to our economy and communities, not only whilst they're studying, but also hopefully post graduation. I think Gabe mentioned about the retention aspect. Again, providing pathways to them post-study is critical. The debate about managing student numbers reflects a kind of a tension between how much do we grow in terms of numbers and as well as maintaining the integrity of the program. We don't want to kind of necessarily risk undermining trust in the system. Otherwise, we'll end up issues with the quality education provided, the integrity of providers as well, and as well as visa holders. Similar to what Gabe mentioned about problem areas, like where with colleges or particular sectors, Australia's had that as long as I can remember in the student sector, and where one issue kind of does arise and gets shut down, something else will come up, and people know how to kind of, you'd say fudge or exploit the system. So we really, the government really needs to kind of ensure that as soon as any kind of patterns arise, it is able to kind of address those from an integrity perspective. Otherwise, you'll undermine, issues, undermine the trust in the overall system. So, if we're seeing those kind of sudden changes, which Gabe mentioned as well, the shifting goalposts as well, it creates that uncertainty, and people who are kind of moving from one country to another, particularly students. They do want certainty in programs, which I think is quite important. The government also needs to be quite consistent and transparent in how it manages its numbers. And then I guess more broadly speaking, Fragomen should really kind of focus on attracting those students who are best aligned to Australia's longer term interests and addressing kind of skill shortages that we have as well. Clearer pathways for higher performing graduates, that stronger integrity checks to maintain the confidence in the system. If we do that well, then it's going to enhance our overall reputation, get trust in the system, and it'll increase our ability to compete globally with other markets as well.
Thanks, Sasko. And I would add to so many similar pressures and threads, and we've all been experiencing the similar shocks to the system and changes in flows. And you've reminded me of the ways, excuse me, in which we have changed our marketing and adjusted our promotional messaging as Austrade in order to adapt to those. Sorry, one moment. Suddenly very croaky. So I've been reflecting as you were talking, Gabe and Sasko, about the shift from we were 100% study in Australia, we moved to study with Australia during the pandemic, and now we have Study Australia that covers the full breadth of what we like to refer to here as our global campus offering. And to be clear, this absolutely includes the opportunity to study here in Australia, because we're at pains to point out that international students remain welcome to study in Australia, but it also includes these newer study opportunities at Australian and provider partner campuses around the world, as well as online. So our approach has really been changing in response to the expansion of offerings and the changes in student preferences and behaviours. We're very active in assisting assisting with accessing new opportunities for providers. And then in turn, we're really active in promoting those expanded offerings to students, not only the offering where they are now, but also the offering where they're increasingly choosing to go. Another point I would make is that it's really clear, it's a clear government priority here to try to better share the benefits of the sector across the country, so with providers and communities right across Australia. And this really requires the deliberate marketing of lesser known Australian study locations, and we like to refer to those as Australia's smaller student cities. And there are so many positive stories to tell about those locations. And another point is around these return on investment for students. So Gabe, you've mentioned this, Sasko, you've referenced this, that we're really focused on demonstrating the value of an Australian education in career terms. And we have always done that, but I think there's a real shift now in our approach to really build awareness of Australia's capability and our offering in fields of study that are most closely aligned to skills shortages. And it's really that talent attraction piece. So where we've produced a recent suite of videos that showcase student and alumni successes in starting a career in Australia as a result of their chosen field. And it's not just about growing an onshore pool of international student and graduate talent, although of course that is excellent. And it's not just about meeting Australia's productivity needs, and it's not just about supporting our international partners seeking skills uplift. It's all of those things, but it's actually, to us, a very learner-centric approach, because the areas of highest demand here are also the areas in highest demand just about everywhere. So whether that's, you can look at any sort of core series of sectors like digital health, infrastructure, green economy, and others. So whether or not a student chooses to remain in Australia after their studies or seek employer support to stay on a subsequent visa, or goes home for their career or to a third country, if they've chosen a field of study most closely aligned to an area of common shortage, they're more likely to find relevant, meaningful employment as a return on their investment in having chosen Australia. And so even before the benefits of the student's future career are felt We also believe that this promotional emphasis helps to nurture a more diverse classroom and learning experience for students, for all enrolled students, because if this, I think, especially true where a student can be encouraged to take up a growing and emerging field of study that might not yet have high international student demand, but already has high employer demand. That has perhaps been something the student hasn't been aware of or students haven't been aware of. And it's not just us, it's not just our views. We know that our students are seeking greater alignment between their chosen course and job readiness in general. So I think we're definitely evolving our promotional efforts, and it's not just messaging. We have external points of validation around future skills indices and others where Australia ranks very highly. But I would lastly say that we also work really closely with all states and territories across Australia, and we might have time to come back to that, I'm not sure, but the Study Australia Partnership works together on this branding and marketing, but also on outreach to employers to ensure that students are really getting that return on investment. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Helen. Look, you mentioned obviously the role of states and territories and working collaboratively with them. I might also come back to you on that point, but maybe Sasko, could you maybe comment from your perspective in terms of that sort of broader migration system and how that integrates with states and territories, your sort of view on the role jurisdictions can actually play in shaping some of the international education for the future so that we're globally competitive. What's the role for jurisdictions do you see?
Yeah, from a visa program perspective, when we're looking at, we're talking about kind of pathways like earlier on, post-graduation, there are a couple of pathways where, particularly under the skilled categories, where you've got state-based nominations for skilled applications, which recognise students who have studied in particular in each state and the type of courses they've kind of completed, but also importantly, like I think Helen touched upon job readiness, and I think that part of these pathways also require students to have kind of worked in particular kind of skilled occupations post graduation as well. I think there's a kind of one of the issues, probably it's a broader issue, is what students kind of and how students kind of utilize the graduate visas after they've completed their courses, and being able to kind of work in occupations which are better aligned to the qualifications they've completed. There is definitely from what we're kind of seeing in practice, but also more broadly speaking, from my understanding, a bit of a mismatch between the roles and where students or graduates are working in compared to their qualification level. Notwithstanding that they may be holding qualifications that are in disciplines where there are recognised kind of shortages. So I think that there's certainly kind of room for the program to be better at helping kind of international students once they kind of graduate, and how to kind of be able to get that relevant experience, which will help them with not only potentially kind of being able to apply for long-term skilled applications here in Australia, but also having relevant work experience that's meaningful to what they've studied as well.
Sorry, Tim seems to have a technical issue there. You were going to continue, Sasko?
Yeah, I guess a couple of other points which I'm kind of looking at more broadly, the government's kind of strategy. I think as part of the government's migration strategy, they did recognise the importance of better support for international students. So it is an issue that the government has recognised exists, and something that they do need to kind of look at in the future. I think outside of better alignment between study areas and labour market demands or shortages, I think there's also scope to be able to kind of improve kind of work-related learning for international students. So expanding things like internships, placements, industry partnerships, just to essentially give the students a better local work experience and networks. And then in the area of kind of vocational reform, I think, given that, in Australia, and I guess there's probably many other jurisdictions, we do have kind of trade shortages across Australia. How can we potentially open up, apprenticeship pathways for overseas students under kind of vocational graduate visa streams? If we get kind of the settings right, particularly at that postgraduate level, international students won't just be here to study and then leave. That they can generally be, an important part of the solution when it comes to, Australia's workforce challenges.
Thanks, Sasko. I think that's a really important point. Just to introduce myself, I'm Andrew Barker, Head of Research at CEDA, and I apologise, Tim has had some technical issues. But I think that point about trade skills is a really important one. A lot of the big changes we have ahead of us, including the energy transition, are going to draw on these skills. So we need to make sure we're developing the skills that Australia needs in the future. I want to bring in one of our questions we've got on Pigeonhole at the moment, because I think it gets to something you mentioned earlier, Gabe. So it's talking about students coming here to study to benefit from the salary gradient, the higher salaries here, as they do in Canada, and I think that's an important point. And then that they're often interested in a working visa rather than a permanent visa. But it gets to the point you were making earlier, Gabe, about there were some potential issues in the system earlier, but that the solution wasn't the right one for that. I guess what can or should we be doing to make sure we are really getting the genuine students in, rather than people who are just coming here to work?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a few things. I think the first thing is you do have to be thoughtful about your policies. And to be honest, something happened in Canada during the pandemic that we had we saw a drop in the number of people coming into the country, I think for obvious reasons, and then a massive increase in the number of people that the government let in. And this was partly driven by a fear that Canada would be facing a labor shortage during the pandemic. I think since this occurred, the consensus almost across the political spectrum was it was a poor decision, because Canada's been very successful in maintaining public, kind of social license for pretty high immigration levels for a long time. And the combination of growing economic uncertainty and then what was obviously a sudden influx of newcomers has shaken that social license and the confidence that Canadians have in our system. So I think it's important to be, I think, more thoughtful and in a deeper dialogue with the public and with stakeholders than Canada was when it made some pretty dramatic changes to its immigration system. I would say that the problem related to that is you need to be having a conversation that's not just about how many, but who. And this is what's continuing to dog the policy in Canada is we got so fixated on solely the question of how many people would be let into the country. We lost sight of the fact that there were, even as numbers came down, certain people we wanted to make sure we kept, and certain other classes of people that, frankly, we wanted fewer of. And we haven't designed our policies to keep the people that we want coming to the country. So I think it's very important to do that from the ground up. Once you realize you have this problem, I think that Canada has done a couple of things that made a lot of sense. One was it identified where by far the greatest abuses of the system were, which were in sort of storefront colleges. And I don't mean to paint all of these institutions with the same brush, but the worst abusers were in that area, who were, really the academic operation was not so substantial. And what really was happening is a lot of people were coming and taking low-wage jobs and doing the bare minimum to count as a registered student. And the government, once, as part of the changes it made, it said we're no longer going to allow these colleges to issue work permits to students who study here. And that essentially solved that problem. I think another thing that they did is they also reduced the number of hours that students, even coming to any of our institutions, were allowed to work while they're studying. So it was that allowed that a student could work up to 40 hours while they were enrolled in a post-secondary institution, and it was reduced to 20. And as one of our university presidents said, if someone is here to study and they're working 40 hours a week, there's probably something wrong. And that's not the system that we want to be building. So I think those two measures have been very helpful. And now I think we need to pay more attention generally in terms of how we design our system to attracting students, and students who will then become people who may contribute to our economy in a longer term way if they end up immigrating here, or if they end up going back and building relationships with Canada through business.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful, Gabe. I mean, and I think for the Australian participants and listeners, that sort of need to maintain social license will certainly ring true here as well. So it's really useful to kind of learn from the Canadian example there. I mean, I guess on that front, for you, Sasko and Helen, is, looking forward, how do we overcome some of these challenges and some of the concerns people have around the system to get more stability in the international education system going forward? What should we be doing in terms of positive steps? Maybe I'll start with you, Helen, and then Sasko.
Sure, and I think that we are in a stable setting now. I think we've come through the volatility of the pandemic era and into more stable settings, and that's certainly been the indication coming out of government from a policy perspective. I also think that we're in, a good place with recognition of the importance of international students and graduates as a pool of talent. And we've had Productivity Commission report, interim report, I should say, Jobs and Skills Australia 2025 report about opportunity and productivity around tertiary harmonisation. We've got a new Australian Tertiary Education Commission that will look at harmonisation around appropriate skilling for Australia's skills needs, a Tertiary System Advisory Council. There's reviews into research and development, commercialisation, and all of the things that really speak to this immense pool of talent that we have onshore in Australia, and indeed, as I said, anyone holding an Australian qualification offshore who's able to seek relevant, meaningful employment. And of course, that's not to gloss over the fact that it has been hard at times for international students and graduates to find those opportunities. And there is more work to be done collectively on all our parts to ensure that Australian employers and businesses and industry understand this opportunity for productivity and greater efficiency and expansion, and that they have this pool of talent here already trained to Australian standards. So there's a lot of work underway in that space. I think it is really closely linked to social license, because at least last time I checked, I think it was 97.2% of Australian businesses are SMEs. And if we can connect international students and graduates with those businesses, we're really talking about broad reach into the Australian community across the country. And speaking of across the country, I do want to acknowledge the work that all of the states and territories do together with Austrade under the Study Australia Partnership. And we have a working group within that partnership that it looks at exactly these issues, at engaging with employers, at improving social license. And we have a really good program of work coming up this financial year that we'll be looking forward to keeping everyone updated on.
Thanks. Just to, to add, the importance of clear, stable settings. I think as mentioned earlier, I think we've had that kind of changes that we took place last year to really recalibrate the program was obviously in part a reaction to the kind of high numbers that we had, particularly post-COVID. I think the government's going to be dealing with high student numbers and those who are already in the country for quite a long time, as it tries to manage the integrity in particular areas of the program. But what it's done, and we're obviously seeing that we've got there's a demand still there for students. However, we're seeing kind of a better quality of international students applying and coming to Australia. The other thing is those kind of pathways postgraduate, which I think are quite important as well. So just continue to have clear targeted post-study work and skilled migration pathways that are available to students, and being aligned to that kind of genuine labour market need of Australia. I think that's quite important. And it also kind of then builds into the greater narrative of benefits that students bring to Australia post-qualification.
Thanks a lot, Sasko and Helen. We've got a few minutes left, so I'll just want to finish up on that point, which I think you've all made about the real benefits that we can get in terms of the pool of talent that we get with students, potentially if they do want to stay on. And there's a question from the audience noting that the visa system is very complex and questioning how can that be simplified to support international students and employers. I mean, you mentioned the number about the very high share of small businesses, so that makes it harder for them to engage with a complex system. Do you think the system needs to be simplified? Can it be simplified? What can we do to make sure that we can really keep on the best talent in terms of visas? I'll go with you first, Sasko, and then Helen,
Sure.
and then Gabe, just to finish up.
Yeah, the actual system was a lot more complicated previously. So there are a lot more visa subclasses, and the current regulations were essentially kind of the amalgamation, you could say, of a number of different kind of classes, the subclasses that existed. So in its current format, it's probably the most exists in its most simplest form. I think what's kind of happened is when we had the introduction of the genuine student requirement last year, that's created obviously for case officers as well, assessing applications. That's created issues in how these applications are assessed, the type of information and documentations are required to assess that requirement. There's a degree of you can say subjectivity to how that's assessed as well. So that's also kind of helped in, I guess, in the higher refusal rate that we're seeing and have been seeing over the past year. So I just think, going back to the earlier points about what's the program objective, and not making too many changes too often, will help applicants as well as providers and everyone else, a lot of stakeholders, in understanding what the system's about as well, and kind of and getting the clarity that people are seeking.
Look, visa system issues are well outside of Austrade's remit, but certainly we see a really important role for us in ensuring that students are aware of the fields of study attached to the areas of highest demand. As I said, that's in Australia, but it's also in their home country and elsewhere around the world. And if we can raise awareness of Australia's excellent capability across the full breadth and depth of those areas, then we'll support students into a more predictable and reliable pathway for their future.
Thanks a lot, Helen. And Gabe, any lessons from Canada there on that pathway?
Well, I can't offer any lessons on how to fix your visa processing system, because I feel confident ours is doing worse than just about everybody's. And part of that has to do with having two levels of government who are now both intimately involved in the application process. One of the things I've been thinking about is how do we create the incentives for government to want to fix these systems? And I think what strikes me is, especially as soon as any kind of anxiety around immigration enters the conversation, it's all about, all of the incentives are about how are you going to prevent and how are you going to keep out. And I think part of what we have to do is start holding government accountable for how are you going to recruit and how are you going to let in. And you noticed in your conversations with Canadians, in the abstract, it's harder to make the case for immigration or for international students. But when you start talking about where are we going to get our doctors, when are we going to get our engineers, what's our birth rate is falling, who's going to provide the services you need, I think people open up. So I think part of the solution here is to make government accountable for the positive achievements related to this and hopefully create some incentives for them to make the systems work better.
Great. Thanks a lot, Gabe. Nice to finish with a positive, because as we've been discussing, there is a real pool of talent that countries like Australia and Canada can draw from, both in terms of higher education, but also in terms of trades, as we talked about as well. And it's always great to learn from the experience from other countries. So really appreciate that Canadian perspective. It's good learning from successful examples in other countries. Sometimes it can be even better to learn the caution tales and lessons, even if the countries involved might not want to talk about them so much. So that's been really excellent to have that international perspective that we can draw from. So thank you very much, Gabe, and Sasko and Helen, for participating today. It's greatly appreciated. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I'd like to also thank our session sponsor today, NAB, who makes this, our sponsors and our members make this sort of event possible. All our viewers today, you will receive a post-event email with a link to the recording of today's discussion, and that will also be available on CEDA's website in approximately 1 week. So thank you very much for your participation and for the insightful questions. And you can stay in touch with upcoming discussions via ceda.com.au, and you can also register for some upcoming events we have, including on the 17th of September, the View from the Opposition with Susan Ley about a responsible path forward, to be held in Melbourne, and the AI Leadership Summit in Brisbane on the 21st and 22nd of October. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for joining.